Saint Augustine of Hippo was in many ways responsible for the unification of Christian theology and ancient Greek philosophy, a union that would shape the Western canon for many centuries. However, much of his philosophical and theological work can be interpreted as a direct response to his life experiences. As such, in this video, we'll explore Augustine's psyche through his autobiographical account in Confessions, and use the philosophers Nietzsche and Kierkegaard to examine his psychology, in hope that this will reveal to us some fundamental aspects of the Christian psychology. To start us off, we'll look at Augustine's perspective on punishment. In Confessions, Augustine makes his view of punishment crystal clear. Punishment is a force for good. What does he mean by this? Well, one of the earliest discussions in this regard is about the punishment he received as a child for playing with his friends when he should have been studying. He acknowledges that this punishment was nothing short of torture to him, yet in nearly the same breath he refers to his pleas to God to spare him this punishment as idiocy. In doing so, Augustine is simultaneously acknowledging the reality of pain and suffering, while also stating that such pain and suffering, real as they may be, are not valid grievances. Rather, the pain and suffering he had to endure is portrayed as a necessary corrective of his supposed sin in not caring about school as much as he should. Thus the sufferer, in this case Augustine himself, is presented as the ultimate cause of the suffering. Such a perspective does two things at once. On the one hand, it preserves within the sufferer a sense of agency, that since they are the cause of the suffering, they have the power to escape suffering by acting differently. On the other hand, the social order dispensing suffering is indiscriminately legitimized, as it is the sufferer who is responsible for the suffering they must endure. Any question of justice and proportionality between alleged crime and accompanying punishment is thus rendered moot. A passage that is particularly illuminating with regards to Augustine's attitude towards suffering as punishment is the following. Referring to God, Augustine writes, "You who fashion pain as a lesson, and lambast us to heal us, and kill us so we don't die away from you." Not only is pain presented here as a tool intentionally fashioned by God, as a means of teaching, but death itself is seen as an extension of God's will. This is particularly important, considering Augustine's loss of his close friend, whom he described as his soul being unable to be without. Augustine describes the death of his friend as being the mercy of God, for in the quote-unquote excessive sweetness of their friendship, they had turned away from God, and thus God had taken the life of his friend to turn them back towards him. As such, it is not only corporeal punishment that is corrective, but experiences of loss and grief are similarly God's tools for disciplining mankind. By implication, this suggests that Augustine was, in his own mind, responsible for the death of his friend, as it was Augustine who had turned him away from the quote-unquote true faith. To understand the psychological aspect of Augustine's relationship with suffering as punishment, it will be useful to draw on Nietzsche's concept of the ascetic priest and of bad conscience from On the Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche writes about how everyone who experiences suffering seeks to find its cause, to locate that cause outside of oneself, and then enact vengeance upon that which caused the suffering. Vengeance as a sort of palliative. However, when someone is unable to enact vengeance, when they are denied an outlet for their contempt, that same desire for violence turns in the only direction it can, inward. It becomes bad conscience. What Nietzsche calls the ascetic priests preaches bad conscience to those who think someone must be blamed for their misery, stating, quote, "Quite so, my sheep, it must be the fault of someone, but you yourself is that someone. You alone are to blame. You yourself are to blame for yourself." End quote. Thus, in a single move, the ascetic priest has allowed us an outlet for our aggression and thirst for vengeance by encouraging us to direct it towards ourselves and thereby find satisfaction in our own self-degradation through bad conscience. If we read Augustine through Nietzsche, it becomes easy to see that Augustine was unable to enact vengeance against the causes of his suffering. As a child, he could hardly seek retribution for the punishment he experienced that, as stated earlier, he compared to torture. Nor could he seek vengeance against the disease that took the life of his friend, for a disease knows neither pain nor suffering, so such things could not be afflicted upon it. Where then could Augustine turn his presumed desire for vengeance, but inward? What other outlet for his vengeance could possibly have been available to him, other than himself? Furthermore, we see that Augustine imposes a view of suffering being deserved, i.e. in need of being turned inward, not only on himself but on others as well. Towards the middle of Confessions, Augustine praises his mother for having put up with his father's infidelity, temperament, and violence. In contrast, he criticizes the wives of other men who carried marks of domestic abuse for complaining about how their husbands treated them. Augustine then, once again, commands his mother, this time for scolding these other women, saying that, quote, "From the moment they had heard what's called the marriage contract read, they should have classed it as a bill of sale by which they become slaves. Hence, they should keep in mind their place in life, in which it was wrong to act insolently towards their owners." End quote. How are we to understand Augustine's mother's stance, and by extension Augustine's own stance, as he reiterates his mother's position as praiseworthy, if not as the preachings of ascetic priests? The question remains why offering an inward direction of blame is such an efficient way of encouraging submission. Why is it that we are so eager to assign responsibility that we willingly assume the faults of others as our own, rather than abandoning the idea of fault altogether? Nietzsche gives us a good answer, as he writes that it is not suffering that is intolerable, but rather, quote, "the lack of an answer to that crying question, why do we suffer?" The senselessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay upon humanity, until the ascetic ideal gave man a meaning. End quote. Furthermore, he writes that in the preachings of the ascetic priests, quote, "suffering found an explanation. Man had saved himself. He had found a meaning for himself. He was no more tossed about like a leaf in the wind. He was no longer a plaything of chance, a casualty of blind fate." End quote. It was perhaps easier for Augustine's mother to see herself and her fellow women as the cause of their own misery, rather than to accept that fate had dealt them a harsh hand by making their society so deeply cruel and unfair towards them. It might have been more comfortable for Augustine to think that his friend's life had been taken from him by a benevolent God, than to recognize the cruelty of chance. Yet such comforts flee from reality, and negate true acceptance of pain, as well as the possibility for change. To delve even deeper into the psyche of Augustine, we turn to the Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and his concept of despair from the sickness unto death. In this book, Kierkegaard lays out two primary proper forms of despair: the despair of not willing to be oneself, and the despair of willing to be oneself. These two are in fact the same, for to want to be oneself is to want to be a self which one currently is not, meaning that it is another form of not wanting to be oneself. What characterizes despair is a desire to do away with oneself, to be rid of oneself, a kind of self-consumption. But, as Kierkegaard writes, it is an impotent self-consumption that is unable to do what it wills. End quote. Kierkegaard goes as far as to compare despair with someone terminally ill who longs for death as their final hope, yet finds themselves unable to die. It is not difficult to see how this idea applies to Augustine. After the loss of his close friend, Augustine expresses a desire not to live, yet a dread of death. He even compares his experience with the story of Orestes and Pylades, who were willing to die for each other or together, as that was preferable to living without one another. To Augustine, the fact that life could go on when his friend was dead, that other living things could be when his friend could not, was foreign and strange. Yet he found himself unable to truly desire death. Indeed, he dreaded it, for as he saw his friend as part of himself, then to lose his own life would be to lose his friend for good. I don't think it's an exaggeration to claim that the description of wanting to die, but being unable to do so, is apt to describe Augustine's mental state at this point. Yet perhaps a more accurate formulation would be that he wants to die, but does not desire death. He wants to be rid of himself, but does not want to lose the part of his friend that is in him. Moreover, Augustine's desire to be rid of himself is expressed more subtly in a few different places in Confessions. One of the most notable, though easily missed, is his discussion on theatre. Augustine observes that people seem to find the greatest satisfaction in seeing depictions of suffering which they can relate to. However, rather than recognize that the theatre may have provided people with an outlet for the emotions that were too overwhelming for them to deal with directly, he adopts a dismissive attitude. Augustine describes the emotions felt by theatregoers as fake, as they are felt in response to fiction. He even goes so far as to call the love of tragedy madness. Augustine even refers to a person being able to relate to what he sees displayed as themselves being, quote, sick of the sort of feeling he sees displayed. This example reveals a denial of the value of feeling itself. The very fact that he likens feelings to sickness is itself proof of this denial, but him displaying that he is able to understand that the feelings felt in response to fiction is rooted in real feeling, yet persisting with his dismissive attitude, cements his rejection of feeling. Perhaps Augustine's turn towards Platonism, which depicts the material realm and the body that exists in it as lesser, can be understood as an extension of his rejection of feeling. After all, don't we feel the most intense feelings corporeally, in our bodies, when our hearts leap with joy and our stomachs turns in discomfort? Don't we describe our most horrible experiences as gut-wrenching? Indeed, if thus considered, then even the greatest and most influential contribution Augustine made to the Western canon was little more than an expression of despair, of his desire to be rid of himself, of his body, and of feeling suffering as such. So to conclude, though Augustine repeatedly acknowledges the power and intensity of suffering, he refers to the sufferer, as we've seen, as mad, foolish, and any objection to suffering as idiocy, whether that sufferer is himself, someone else, or an abstract hypothetical person. Thus, to Augustine, suffering, or more precisely the subjective experiences of the sufferer, is not to be acknowledged as having value in and of itself. Suffering has a value as a means to an end, as a corrective measure to guide the sufferer towards the correct path, but nothing more than that. If the experience of suffering is indulged in for its own sake, that is to say, felt, such as with the theatre, it is to be condemned as an example of the wretched nature of humankind. When indignation towards that which caused one to suffer is expressed, it is to be redirected inwards, towards oneself. In dismissing suffering as having value in itself, Augustine is encouraging a radically passive attitude towards the conditions of existence. The natural response to suffering is to try to change what caused that suffering. When, however, suffering is seen as either invalid or one's own fault, the root cause of that suffering is left uninvestigated, and thus any possibility for change is amputated. Furthermore, if Augustine's dismissal of suffering is indeed rooted in self-rejection, as this analysis has suggested, then his command that others should reject suffering and direct blame inwards can be read as an attempt on his part to impose his own despair of not wanting to be himself onto others. Now it's time for you to tell me what you think of Augustine. Leave a comment down below and tell me, and like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. For now, however, this is all I have for you. I hope you have a nice day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.